Welcome to another episode of TPM Ridge, the podcast where we bring in industry leaders in technical program management to share their insights, experiences, and the lessons they've learned on the front lines of the TPM movement. I'm your host, Doran Katz, and each week we dive in deep into the methodologies, mindsets, and tools that will empower you to drive excellence in technical program management. Whether you're new to TPM or looking to take your skills to the next level, this podcast is your go-to resource for transforming TPM principles into real-world success. Okay, welcome. We've got two special guests today, Bruce and Melissa, and they are the authors of the book Aligned. And I wanted to introduce you both. Bruce, a recognized expert in product management, leadership, and innovation, and the founder of Product Culture, a consultancy firm that helps organizations develop the culture. Yep, got the logo there. And process for successful product development. And Melissa, product management professional, thought leader in customer-focused product strategies, and with extensive experience shaping product management best practices and advocating for alignment between company vision and customer needs. And I wanted to welcome you both, and just tell us a little bit about yourselves in your own words.
Sure. Thank you for having us. I'm Melissa. I've spent about 20 years in product management at companies of various sizes and stages, primarily in the B2B space. And I've been coaching for a couple of years, and Bruce at Product Culture, and working on this book Aligned. And I think that we've had a lot of good feedback so far. Stakeholder management seems to be a popular source of stress for product folks.
My background is similar. Like Melissa, I was a product person for many years, worked my way up to VP of product at a startup, and began to see patterns of similar problems and challenges for product teams in multiple different companies. And for the past 11 years, I've been a coach and advisor and author and speaker. And I've worked with hundreds of companies all around the world. And I've figured out that there are certain recurring patterns about the culture of organizations that help to make them successful. That's where the idea of product culture comes from. One of those key factors for success is good stakeholder management. That's where the book came from.
Absolutely. And I was going to ask you what was the inspiration for this book? And, I guess those patterns are things that you've sort of picked out. And I mean, alignment is paramount to all sorts of product managers, TPMs as well. While a lot of TPMs focus on the technical side of execution, the soft skills, the alignment and all that is something that's kind of lacking or not as focused on. But just tell us, why is alignment important? What is the the nexus for writing this book, I guess, into focusing on alignment?
Well, each of us has had, I think, several experiences, but at least one really seminal experience where we realized we're missing a whole dimension to this job. That you can have a great strategy and have product market fit and feel like you've done all the technical or harder parts of the job right, and then realize, oh, you don't have your team behind you. For me, it was my first product manager job, my first software product. It was terrific from all of the objective standpoints, except I didn't have my marketing team or my sales team or my support team behind me. When it came time to launch, they were off working on other things and they had no time for my little lab experiment. And it went nowhere because maybe I had product market fit, but I didn't have product organization fit. And that just opened my eyes to a whole extra level that really, I think, is in that case of that product was the difference between success and failure.
I had some experiences with the folks on my team who worked for me, and I really wanted to give them a book like this, and it didn't exist. So, one of the big problems that I was finding that folks were having was being able to say no. So I had one person on my team who just said yes to everything because they felt bad saying no, even though they knew they couldn't do it. I had somebody else on my team who said no to everything and never gave an explanation. And people were like, what's going on? Why is she saying no to everything? And so I originally had a concept for a book on just saying no to stakeholders. And I talked to Bruce, and he's like, I feel like there's more here, but that ended up being one chapter.
It's still in the book, still a key
Yes.
part of the job, right? But yeah,
Yeah.
there's a lot more to it. There's getting to yes. There's co-creating a roadmap. There's a lot more to it.
Yeah, no, and I'll get back to the no because that's one of the chapters that I was very interested in as well, actually, and something that I've sort of lacked with saying sometimes, depending on the context and the environment. But in one of your early chapters, you talked about organizational structure, functional versus matrix, and something that we're even taught in our PMP exams and things like that. But what techniques do you use to manage stakeholders whom aren't your direct line of reporting or across in different types of organizational structures?
I
I
don't think
think
you ever have stakeholders that directly report to you, right? Like that would just be your team.
Right.
I don't know, Bruce, you
yeah,
had some.
this is kind of the universal situation. I feel like, or nearly so. We all work in, formally speaking, some form of matrix organization where we depend on people of different functions to get the
Right.
job done, to get the product out, sold, marketed, supported, financed, etc. So all of those are functions, and probably, like Melissa said, none of them report
Mm,
to you. There are some organizations where you have a product management like GM function, and
yeah.
maybe some of those people, often not all of them, but some of them do report to you. But that's relatively rare compared to that cross-functional matrix where you've got to lead by convincing people it's the right thing to do, as opposed to by just telling them do this, do that, do the other thing. I think it's a really important leadership skill. In fact, people complain about managers who are micromanagers because they just tell you what to do all the time. And we have, maybe in product, the advantage that we can't do that,
Mm,
because
There's
why would they listen to us?
there's a famous quote. I'm forgetting the name of the person right now, but it's, I'm going to build a boat not by instructing people to find wood and hammer it together, but by
mm,
teaching them to yearn for the vast endless sea, right? And so like a lot of it is by motivation, right? They're going to build a boat because they want to go to sea, not because you're
right.
telling them to nail things together. So really working with your stakeholders and figuring out what are their motivations, right? What drives them? What are their incentives? How do they measure success, and appeal to that as opposed to just trying to convince them to do your thing.
Right. So we have some pretty specific suggestions about how to accomplish that in the book. The first thing, as you alluded to, is to map it out. Understand the structure of your organization so that you know who you depend on and where they're situated within the organization to be successful. Sometimes that'll be obvious from the org chart, and sometimes it won't. Sometimes it's because there's hidden power players who you don't report to them, they don't report to you. There's no obvious traceability on the org chart, but they are the sort of person who the CEO has coffee with every day. And so they are whispering in the CEO's ear about what they think is important, and you want your project or product or whatever it is to be on that person's list. So you're mapping that out, and then you aren't, like Melissa says, you don't just go and just like hammer people on why they should be supporting your initiative, whatever it is, but instead you do what we call a stakeholder interview, which is honestly, if you're a
Mm,
product manager and you've done you've built up your skills in how to interview customers, it's the same sort of interview. You don't start off by, again, hammering them with your awesome demo, but instead asking them about themselves, about their job, about what success looks like, what they're trying to accomplish, what numbers they need to hit by the end of the quarter, where their bonus is coming from, and where they're struggling with that. So you uncover challenges, problems, jobs to be done, just like you would with a customer. It's much easier to build not only rapport, but a bridge to between your goals and their goals if you know what they are.
right. And I know in your book you also talked about the DACI model, one of the tools, similar to RACI, but yeah, as a tool for decision making and sort of And I guess this is something you do as part of the interview process, or at which phase do you normally look at doing this? And tell us a little bit about
So
your process. Yeah.
yeah, so the Daisy model is essentially like figuring out or deciding who is the decider. So I've found a lot of times that when a project gets stuck, you're like, why are we still talking about this? Why is nobody doing
Mm.
anything? You're like, oh, because we didn't name somebody to be the decision maker. So nobody is making decisions because nobody knows who's supposed to be making the decisions. So the role of Daisy is driver, please
Approver.
refer. I think I memorized it. Informed and consulted. So the point of the driver is not just to make all the decisions. It's to
Mm.
involve the right people, get the right feedback from people to come up with a decision that everybody is aligned with. But you need to have that decision maker. Otherwise, things sort of get stopped up, right? Things don't progress. And sometimes the decision maker, you realize at the end, oh, actually, the decision maker isn't here at all. Like the person who needs to make the decision isn't even in the room. So those kinds of realizations, once you go through the process to figure out who the decision maker is, can be really revealing about why you're stuck in something.
Yeah. And I know at Amazon, working here in the Pacific Northwest, they have what's called a single-threaded owner. They
Mm-hmm.
always try to find somebody and say, "Well, you are responsible," and
It's
it's
the
sort of
same concept. It's
yeah,
single-threaded owner, or Apple calls it the DRI, directly responsible individual.
Now,
It's the
right.
exact.
some teams have multiples of those on each initiative, which I think is really laughable. But right, because it's a directly responsible individual or a single threaded owner, right? And the whole name has just one person. If you have
Right.
multiple people or a team of people, you need a team of people in order to help the decision maker. But when you have
Absolutely.
multiple, like if it's everybody's responsibility, it's nobody's responsibility. And that's the same
Right.
thing with decisions, because if you have multiple people who are all in charge of making the decision and they make different decisions, now you're stuck.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So one of two things happens. Either you get misalignment, people going off in different directions, or you get everyone frozen because they're not sure what the decision is, and no one's sure how to make a decision because there isn't a clear owner. So I agree with Melissa, and the DACY framework backs this up. There is
Mm.
one driver, one approver, and then multiple people who are consulted, and multiple people who are informed. This is sort of a split in my mind between an authoritative, directive, top down, I'm the decider and I'm just going to decide and you all have to put up with it, versus a bottom up, we have to arrive at consensus, which may never occur. So we're
Mm.
sort of stuck in endless talking. The way out of either of those bad situations is one owner, but the obligation to take input from everyone who's concerned.
Right. You get advice, you get data points and input from the working group, and essentially you don't get a decision paralysis by working as a consensus, but essentially using that to come to a decision.
This is how you get to a disagree and commit sort of decision.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and those are one of the values of Amazon as well. Disagree and commit. When I was working with
Right.
that ingrained straight into us. But so working with diverse stakeholders, you often come across those that have different decision making styles. Some that are data driven, intuitive, or from the guts, consensus based. So how do you tailor your communications across all of those stakeholders to gain alignment?
Right. You have to address the different thinking styles of different people. Organizations, many of them will have a dominant style that is common across the organization, sure, but you're always going to have the outlier. You're always going to have, in addition to a bunch of very data wonk sort of product managers or analysts or whatever, you're probably
Mm.
going to have the Captain Kirk sort of person that likes to shoot from the hip and ask questions later. And you've got to sell the inspiration to that person while backing it up with the data for the rest of the team, right? So it's not a question of adapting your style to
Mm.
one dominant style of the organization. It's a question of speaking different languages as you go through your day. And suppose you're putting together your PR FAQ or your weekly update or whatever it is, you've got to speak to each one of those personas, really, just like you would if you were trying to do your marketing. You've got to
Right.
speak to all of them at once. We used the DISC framework and its personality types, pulling out the parts that were the most relevant to decision making for this. So hopefully that's familiar to a lot of folks.
Yeah. Well, I'll post something up on that in case a bit of one-on-one for those that aren't. But yeah, interesting. And so relationships is also important, right? When you after you identify your stakeholders, you want to build a rapport, a relationship with those stakeholders. Why is building rapport with stakeholders essential?
Well, if you think about the example, right, where you're working with, you're working, somebody comes up to you and they're like, "Hey, can you do this thing for me?" Your reaction will be different if you have only just met them that moment and you're like, who is this person and why do they want something from me? Versus you've been working with them for a while, you've built some rapport, you've gone and got coffee, you're probably gonna be like, yeah, like what's going on? How can I help? Versus you don't have an existing relationship and you're like, please go away. I don't know who you are. So I think building those relationships, just like if you're looking for a job, the best time to look for a job is when you don't urgently need one. The best time to build a relationship is when you don't have an urgent ask, right? So, be kind of networking in your company, be building those relationships. Like Bruce said before, the power players, identify who are those key decision makers in the company, who are those key influencers, and just make sure that you have some relationships with people. And it's not kind of transactional. Like it seems like, oh, in case I need something from them. But like you should be building these relationships in your company because it gives you a better idea of what's going on in different departments. It gives you a better sense of how your decisions are going to affect other groups. It gives you a lot more information, context that you can use to do your job better. In addition to building these relationships, just in case there's something down the road that you could use somebody's help with.
Context. I'm really glad you mentioned that word because I think that's the most important bit. You ever have a conversation with somebody else in your company where you ask them the straightforward question and you get a straightforward answer, but you have the sense that that's not the whole story. You have the sense, the answer seems a little too simple, a little too pat, and then you find out later that they were thinking something completely different, but they weren't willing to tell you because they don't know you. They don't know if they can really trust you. So in order to get past the easy answer to the real answer, you've got to develop a certain amount of trust between you and your stakeholders. In order for that to happen, you've got to be real human beings to each other, not just people who fill out boxes on the org chart. Not, you got to get past the official answer, the safe answer, to the real answer that's going to be the difference between them actually actively supporting your thing and maybe not. Maybe in the budget meeting, they don't stand up and defend your project when things are being cut because you weren't able to come to a real understanding.
Yeah, no, I've definitely been in that situation working with engineers, and you kind of get a sense of an explanation of something, but when it comes to an all important meeting, they kind of give a different answer, and you kind of feel like you've been misled and all that. And if you work in a Scrum team, hopefully a good functioning Scrum team, you kind of build that trust. You have all those different rituals. But if you work in sort of a matrix or as a TPM across with other stakeholders in leadership, you don't usually have that same intimacy that you kind of build over time. And so sometimes
That's
you have to
exactly right.
Yeah.
That intimacy comes fairly naturally from working every day with the same people inside of your squad, right? But if your product or your project or whatever is going to be really successful, you have to reach out and build that rapport with a lot more people around the organization, not just the people you work with every day. And because you don't sit with them every day, because they don't feel like their job is dependent on your job, it's more effort on your part. It won't just come naturally unless you make an effort.
Yeah,
Right. It
and
also,
you
yeah.
can you
Go
can
ahead.
create connections with people, right? Like a Scrum team is working day in day out together. They have this kind of shared experience the highs and the lows of being on an intimate team. But if you're trying to build a relationship with somebody in marketing or finance, maybe you only see them once a month for half an hour or something like that. Finding those kind of connections that you have with each other is a good way to build rapport, to make sure that they think of you as a real person, as opposed to just like,
Right.
the TPM or the whoever, right? That you're Daron, you're a person who's like a real person, has real connections.
We go and provide some concrete advice on this particular point in the book because it's super important. Melissa, you hit on one of the key things that you're trying to accomplish is to become a real person in the eyes of the other of your stakeholders and not just some functionary. The first principle of that is that you ideally want to meet them in person if you can. And today that's not guaranteed, right? We do a lot of work virtually remote, but we've both had the experience where you don't get treated the same as a real human by people who you've never met in person. Even if you've seen them over Zoom, somehow there's still pixels rather than flesh and blood, right? So we recommend that you find an excuse to meet at least once in person, and if more often as possible too. And failing that, you still want to try to make as personal and intimate a connection as you can. Don't always be in group meetings. Find an excuse to talk with them one-on-one about something over video if you can, or text with them. Text is a more informal, intimate sort of one-on-one, or can be one-on-one sort of interaction mode, sort of medium. And so you're sort of hacking the friendship circuitry there in all of our brains. You do have to be a little bit careful with it. Melissa and I discovered in going over various drafts of the book that we didn't necessarily personally feel comfortable with the same sorts of techniques. One thing that we both have used is, for example, camping out with your laptop by the coffee machine in the office and wait for people to come by. Hey, have you got a second? Anybody can do that. But when I suggested invite people out for coffee or a beer after work, Melissa was like, well, as a woman, I'm a little less comfortable with that. And I get that. So you got to work with what you're comfortable with and what would not be unexpected or transgressive within your organization, within the culture of that. But within those bounds, you want to seek any opportunity you can to make a personal one-on-one connection with stakeholders.
Yeah. Sometimes in the virtual world, you can make an excuse to see somebody in person. If, for example, you live in the town where the headquarters are and you don't necessarily go into the office, but you've heard that some executive is coming into town, maybe you show up that day, right? Or you're going to go do a customer visit and you're like, hey, marketing person, we've been talking about this for a while. Will you come with me to see this customer? I really want to show you XYZ. And then you have an opportunity to do a little business dinner. And right. So you can try to make excuses. I feel like once you meet somebody in person, even once, it makes all the kind of virtual stuff a little more personable.
Right. And
Yeah,
then
absolutely.
I know it sounds dumb, but just making small talk at the beginning and end of a Zoom call is the thing we now do, or many of us do, instead of the hallway conversation before or after on the way into or out of the conference room. So maybe it starts off just by talking about the weather or sports or something, but even those little niceties make you a little bit more of a person. Especially if you give a real answer instead of a yes, the weather is nice today sort of answer.
Yeah, well, I think that's probably a moot question here in the Pacific Northwest since it's raining every day, but I'll have to come up with a different question.
Right, right.
Yeah, and you mentioned your book vulnerability. So as a trait of that you demonstrate in leadership. So I guess when we talk about in the context here of making small talk and building a relationship, can you tell us a little bit more about when it would be appropriate to show vulnerability to your peers, stakeholders?
Yeah, I think what a lot of people, some people get vulnerability wrong, for lack of a better word, right? It's not just telling everything. It's not like end all be all. It's not like crying in a room, right? Like being vulnerable is just sort of calling out what everybody knows to be true and talking about it, right? So it's talking about the actual problems that you're having rather than trying to gloss over them because you're afraid to say something, right? It's taking on the risk that the other person won't like what you said. And it's you have to have a culture in place where it's okay to do that. So if somebody says what they feel and management says, no, you're wrong, you're terrible, or fires people or yells at people, nobody's going to do that. Like nobody's going to actually say what they feel. So it has to be an environment that's conducive to that. And managers and leaders, I think, have that opportunity, responsibility to create a space where people can say what they're really thinking, because that's where you find the actual problems. That's where you find the opportunities. That's where you find the innovation, is for people to feel like they're allowed to speak up and, call out the elephant in the room. Like, hey, we're all here. We all keep talking about this thing, but like nobody's talking about this. I think we should talk about it. And those are the kinds of things where you're not sure how people are going to react, but you say it anyway because it's important.
That's right. And I think a lot of product people are in those leadership roles, or at least have the opportunity as cross-functional team leaders to take those roles of setting the tone, of making it safe to say something that might be awkward or might be personal, not too personal. But you can, and maybe you'll see this, but if I start off the meeting by giving the here's why we're here sort of agenda sort of stuff, but then some, but I also say, when somebody asks me how I am, well, actually my back is kind of bothering me today. That small, subtle thing of admitting weakness opens up the conversation for the truth instead of the pat answer. You might also be the sort of person who's expected to have all the answers as a product manager, but it's really disarming and really encouraging of an honest conversation when you say, I don't know. And when you say, I'm open to suggestions here, I'm not sure what the best path is. When you say, I don't have that information, of course, you might want to get that information. But when someone asks a question, rather than trying to give a fuzzy answer or a made up answer, you can say, I don't know. And that tends to create that safe space.
Yeah, it is profound. Yeah, you should feel empowered to not know everything.
Right.
Be able to say, I'll get back to you on that. So
I'll find out.
Right. One of the chapters I really enjoyed in the book was on roadmap. TPMs love roadmaps, just like product managers, right? It's kind of our path to success, and being hyper focused on roadmap and roadmap alignment. We as TPMs go through the gauntlet of maneuvering through stakeholders across teams, cross teams. How do you ensure that all key stakeholders align on your roadmap objectives?
Well, first, the pre-read is you have to read this entire book that I co-wrote before this book on stakeholder management, on how to do great outcome-based roadmaps, which does have a bit of process in it. But we also have a whole chapter on it here in Aligned.
And I think I would rephrase your question, right? So you asked, how do you get the stakeholders to align on your roadmap? And I would argue that if it's not your roadmap, but everybody's roadmap, not that you're giving up control, right? You're still the decision maker. But if your stakeholders feel some stake in the roadmap, it's hard to argue with the plan you helped create. So if you involve your stakeholders early and figure out what it is that they need, then you avoid the thing where you come to the end and they're like, well, where's this thing? Right? And you're like, well, you never mentioned that thing, because you should have those conversations beforehand. So I would say, if you don't think of it as your roadmap, but think of it as like the roadmap, that you're on the same team with your stakeholders. You all want to see success. You all want to see, customer value. You all want to see the company succeed, and that you're coming up with a plan that achieves everything that you're aiming to achieve together.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I it's a common journey. If you make it just about your journey, then basically, there's no compelling reason for anyone else to have a vested interest. And I was listening to an interesting podcast this morning on persuasion, and one of the things one of the key values is from one of the Stanford podcasts, and they were talking about unity, and you get a lot more persuasiveness if you use the unity value. Basically, everyone feels like they're part of something. Otherwise, it's you lose the persuasion
Yeah.
value.
I don't want to do your thing, but I'll do our thing.
Right.
Yeah.
And if you do that right, then it's like Melissa said, it's not your plan, it's our plan. And you're not the only one defending it when somebody has a bright idea because they read an article, or when the big deal comes in and they want to insert something into the roadmap at the last minute. You've got a whole team of people who are like, wait, hang on, we are depending on the other stuff on the roadmap.
We went through a lot of work to put this together, and
Right.
we're not convinced yet that this new thing is going to be better than the stuff we're already planning on.
And wouldn't it be nice if you had some backup on defending your
Right.
roadmap from randomization?
Right. Absolutely. Okay, I can talk for hours about roadmap. I got about 25 questions here, but I'll circle to the last area that I wanted to chat about, and that's about challenges. So managing difficult stakeholders, that's a common challenge for TPMs, for product managers as well, alike. How do you handle stakeholders who consistently push back or create friction in your projects?
We have a whole bunch of techniques depending on the sort of difficulty that you're running into, but I'll share a favorite one, which is to try to talk to them one-on-one about anything you think that will be controversial with them or that they will have strong opinions about. I tell a story in the book about when I took over a product as product manager, and there was a technical architect on the team who was extremely disruptive to any sort of new anything I wanted to introduce to our roadmap. And she would do it in the team meeting. As soon as I brought up the idea, she was like, "Oh, you're going off the rails here. This is never going to work." And the rest of the team was actually really uncomfortable with this. They were kind of like, "Mom and Dad are fighting. What are we supposed to do?" And what I learned, I picked this tip up actually from the previous product manager who said, "Oh, I know exactly how to handle this person," was to preview those new ideas with her one-on-one before the group meeting, to let her absorb them and think about them, and we could debate them or maybe even modify them one-on-one, which did a couple of things. One is it gave her time to think. So if she was going to have a negative reaction, nobody else had to see that. Number two, it gave me a chance to understand what her concerns were and maybe modify the plan, because maybe she has a point, before, again, it goes to the rest of the team. And number three, she really appreciated that I was valuing her input. And so she wasn't fighting with me. It didn't feel that way. It felt more like we were collaborating on arriving at the best answer.
Yeah, I was going to say collaboration. That's kind of what you've sort of facilitated by having that heads up
Right.
before. Yeah.
I think the other thing is usually people aren't out to get you, right? Usually, if there's something that somebody's doing that you don't understand or that you find frustrating, it's because there's something that you don't know. And so being curious and finding out, asking questions like, hey, that's not what you said last week. I would just really like to understand more about, what your goals are and what success means to you. And, did something change this week, or what's going on? I'd like to understand because I want to make sure that we're on the same page. Right. So instead of being like, why are you being so annoying? It's like, okay, well, maybe there's something I don't know. Let me try to put myself in this person's shoes. Maybe they're micromanaging because they need more information from me. And maybe if I give them more information more often, they won't feel the need to come in and try to handle things themselves. So, like, a lot of the things, if you kind of think it through and come up with some ideas for what might be going on and actually talk to them and figure out, is there something that's stressing you out? Could I have done something better? A lot of times you find out enough to repair the relationship.
Show some genuine care and curiosity about what the source of the difficulty is. And, sometimes they're just going to say, the problem is that you suck. But more often than not, you're going to find out that there's something going on with them. They're getting a lot of pressure from their boss, or the numbers aren't looking good for the quarter, or just they were having a bad day. Their back is acting up, whatever. Or it could even be you. Melissa wrote this whole section afterwards about checking yourself. Maybe your back is bothering you and you're just cranky and you're reacting poorly to everything everyone says. Or you're having trouble with your kids or something. And so maybe you need a little bit of a break to cool off. Stepping back from the immediate argument or conflict with the person and asking yourself, being curious about what's going on with you, with them, with the company, that might be not obvious, and informing how other people are acting, I think is the first best advice. And it starts with the old saw of assume positive intent.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to tie in everything we've talked about today, we talked about, personas, and, sometimes you make assumptions or things like that. And this is where you kind of, if you learn more about the person, you kind of, you sort of build that more accurate persona. And then we talked about not being transactional. And, it's part of this whole sort of empathy and understanding your stakeholders. So I think it kind of ties everything in together here when you kind of, if you build and the relationship and the rapport, then, you get to the stage now where you kind of have that trust and communication, I think,
right.
as well.
That's right. These are the soft skills that don't get talked about enough, but that we all depend on to do our jobs. We've been talking at conferences and meetups for months now about this topic, and every time the reception is the same. Thank you so much for talking about this. Nobody talks about it, and yet it's the hardest part of my job every day.
Yeah. It doesn't come natural for a lot of people. Sometimes they have to, think and change your approach. And, but I think we're a little bit out of time. We're a few minutes over, but yeah, we'd love for you guys to come over on the West Coast, to come some of our summits or meetups across California, Washington. But thank you for your time today. Your book, Aligned, is a quintessential book, I'd say, for TPMs and for other product managers as well. And, for somebody who sort of, works in a master servant sort of role, working, without the authority, being able to, to get stakeholders on your side is imperative. So I'll post the links to the book. Go out and get the book. I listen to the Audible version on my daily commute, and perhaps we'll have to have another podcast on the roadmap book that you have up there as well.
That would be great.
Yeah,
there's one
absolutely.
other link people should be aware of at alignedthebook.com. In return for your email address, we provide some free bonus content from the book, including a downloadable template version of our stakeholder canvas, which we recommend using in place of the org chart. So that's alignedthebook.com.
Great, fantastic, and we'll add some show notes afterwards as well, and post on our social media. But it's been an enlightening meeting, enlightening chat. Thanks, Melissa. Thanks, Bruce.
Thanks for having us.